All right, so maybe you've noticed, and maybe you haven't, that we go back and forth between the Old Testament and the New Testament each time that we switch, studies of books of the Bible. And that is primarily because we think it's really important that we see how the whole Bible is tied together and that it's one cohesive message from beginning to end. And so that's why we do that. So we're going to start the book of James today. James comes up pretty often as people mention favorite epistles or people look to memorize an entire book of the Bible and in other, various settings. It's been almost 10 years since I last studied and taught this book. So I thought I would throw my take on this book out there and give my thoughts on this, somewhat strange epistle. Okay, and so we're going to title this whole study of the book of James, Practical Spirituality for the Real World, because that's what I think this book really is. Okay, it's like practical solutions to real world problems that everybody faces. And as is almost always the case, I would encourage you to read ahead a little bit each week. I think you'll be best prepared that way to get everything possible out of our time together on Sunday mornings. And, then bring your Bible with you to make notes and see how your translation might be different than the one that I have up, stuff like that. Anyway, if you do read ahead some, you'll see that this book is organized in a fairly topical way. All right. And the first little section is what we're going to check out this morning. And it's about victory inside the pressure cooker that is your life. So is there pressure in your life? Probably. Okay. And James has got some advice and some answers for you. But before we get too deep into that, I want to go over a little bit of background so that we better understand this book of the Bible. So I called this epistle strange a minute ago. Maybe a better word is unusual, and I think you'll see in a minute why I would say that. The letter begins with the author introducing himself and identifying who his audience is. It says, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad, greetings. So we call this book the book of James, and that's because the author's name is James, as he says right there. So who is this guy? James, right? There are really only two legitimate possibilities, and the text doesn't really tell us which one it is. Some have postulated that this is James, the brother of John, right? One of the sons of Zebedee, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. And in fact, that James had a very close relationship with Jesus. Okay, he was part of Jesus's inner circle. James, Peter, and John were kind of like Jesus's closest homies. But Acts chapter 12 tells us that James was martyred very, very early. And that was kind of a huge event in the early church. And so it probably wasn't that James, all right, although it is possible. This is more likely to be James, Jesus' little brother or half-brother, however you want to put that together in your mind. And so that would make this the James that's described in Acts 15 and in 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 1 and various other new, places in the New Testament. And so during the life of Jesus, this brother of his didn't follow him at all. In fact, he was really hostile to the idea that his brother could be the Messiah. But after the resurrection, it becomes really clear that James is able to understand that Jesus is more than just his big brother. He's the Lord. He was the promised Messiah. And this James actually carried a really big bat in the early church. Okay, he really did influence and help shape the way that the early Christian movement was kind of shaking out. And he says that he's writing to the 12 tribes that are dispersed abroad. And so he is, of course, referencing the believers that have a Jewish background. All right, so the earliest Christians, for the most part, were Jews that had come to faith in Christ. And Acts 2 tells us that thousands of them had come to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, and then later for Pentecost, and a great many of them came to Christ. And then they went back home to wherever they came from. And so in that sense, the believers were dispersed all over the empire. James is writing to these people who have come to faith in Jesus Christ as the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, and he's writing to them as brothers and sisters of his that are Jewish. Okay, and so that makes this epistle of James one of the most Jewish things that we have in the New Testament. Okay, most of the New Testament is written to a pretty mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles. But this is written to the dispersed tribes of Israel. This is a Jewish author writing to a Jewish audience. And the clear emphasis of the letter from James comes right out of the framework and the thought patterns of the Old Testament. Okay? It's wisdom literature. And if you read the Proverbs and then you read the book of James, you're going to see that they sound very similar. All right, and the way that they're arranged and the way that they work out the points that they're making, they just sound a lot alike. And so, for instance, the book of James has a real focus on the practical as opposed to the doctrinal. Okay, so not too terribly long ago, we studied the book of Romans. And when you read through Romans and then read James, you'll understand the difference that I'm talking about here. Romans is very, very doctrinal, and Paul is arguing the case of the Christian message in very careful detail. Okay, but James is far less concerned with proving the case for Christ or what the doctrines of belief are. And he's a lot more concerned with what it looks like in practice. So what does it look like in your life to really believe that these things are true of Christ? And so if you see yourself as a real practical person, then you're going to think this book is awesome. It really gets down to where the rubber meets the road, I think, and what it is that you do about this kind of belief in your life. And so here's a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. In chapter 3:13, he says, "Who among you is wise? Let him show it by his good behavior." So that's pretty practical stuff. He's not really exploring the nature of wisdom. He's going right at what wisdom really looks like in practice. And he says in chapter 2, in a passage that has created a ton of controversy over the centuries, and we're going to spend some time on it in a coming week, he says, "Without works, faith is useless." All right, so that's a little bit different tone than you usually find in a letter from Paul, okay, who says things like faith plus nothing, and it's all about faith, and the grace of God is the only way to get there. And I think that we'll find that James is completely on board with those points that Paul makes, but his emphasis and his focus is not on doctrine. It's on what faith really looks like in the life of a true believer. And then in 2:22, he says, "As a result of works, faith is perfected." All right, so you can see that this focus is super practical. And so he's trying to give us a picture of what it really looks like to live for Christ and to live out our faith. So James employs a literary style that is very common among Jewish writers of his own day and back into the days of the Old Testament, where he uses a lot of contrasting language. Okay, so he talks about faith versus works and rich versus poor. And he talks about language either cursing or blessing. And so he works all these contrasts. And he is trying to say that if you're doing it wrong, you need to do it right. Okay, and if you're doing it right, then this is how you keep being the kind of person that God wants you to be in this area that he's talking about. So contrasts are a huge part of this book. And he also uses these super vivid word pictures. All right, so he says the tongue is a fire. All right, so he talks about people who are given over to chronic doubt as being like the foam on the sea, just being tossed around by the waves. And so for many people, this is really helpful, and it allows people to really question whether or not he's talking about them. And he has all these pithy one-liners that are really difficult to forget. Okay, faith without works is dead. That's an easy thing to remember. Okay, you can just kind of take that bit of text and stick it in your back pocket and pull it out whenever you need it. And it really feels like there's something meaningful that you're taking away with you, and it brings you to the question of whether or not you're going to believe just in an intellectual way, or are you going to believe in such a way that it really works itself out and everyone else can see it in your life and infer what you believe from it. So that's the way that James writes. It's super practical and super interesting because it's very different from the way the rest of the New Testament is constructed. And so this morning we're going to start the study of this book by talking about this issue that James starts with, and that is the topic of suffering. So this is where our passage really starts. It says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him." All right, so let's start with the subject here. He says, various trials. All right, well, what is a trial? A trial is something that's difficult, right? It's something that's not exactly what you were hoping was going to happen. And that makes trials a kind of suffering, right? And he says various trials. And the word various here is the same word that would be used to describe the whole color spectrum. Okay, he's basically saying that in our lives, all of us are going to face suffering. And that suffering is going to be on many different levels and in many different areas. And some of you, like me, have brought a lot of the pain that you're experiencing into your own life by your own stupid choices, all right, or your own poor attitudes, or your own bad habits that sort of derail the good things in your life. All right, we have super thick skulls, and it causes some suffering in our lives. So this passage is going to have some things to say to us. Some people here have gone through or are going through significant physical suffering for things that aren't really bad from bad decisions on our part. All right, they're just because we live in a broken world and sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes our bodies break down. All right, that's a kind of suffering. And that's a kind of suffering that most of us will endure at some point. Okay, we're going to die. And for most of us, it's not going to be in our sleep while we're perfectly healthy. Okay, there's going to be some suffering involved. So we all suffer. We suffer relationally. I think that this can be the most painful kind of suffering because it's the kind of thing that's rooted in the free choice of other people. And so it feels like someone else is hurting you. Okay, perhaps you feel like that in your marriage or in your close relationships. Maybe there's pain in your life because of things that happened very early in your life. And even now, as an adult, you're struggling in important and in intimate areas of your life. All right, so all of us in various ways, and some of us are double dipping here, are suffering in our life. So this passage should really speak to us. And it's appropriate when you're reading a passage like this to ask yourself, in what ways are you suffering? Okay, the ways that we are suffering are the trials that James is talking about here. And he says that these trials are a testing of your faith. So that's the next important thing about these things. A trial is a test of faith. But, not in some sort of Monty Python way where you have to get the 3 questions right in order to get across the bridge. All right. This is not a true, false, pass, fail kind of test. It's not what he's talking about here. And so as James uses the term a test of faith, it's not about testing the truth of our faith or the genuineness of it. He's talking about a test of the adequacy of our faith. And he is saying that it is possible to believe that the right things are true, but you may not believe them adequately to bring you through life in a victorious way. Okay, you can believe all the right things and your life would still be in the ash heap because you haven't learned to take these things that you believe and practically apply them to the particular circumstances of your life. So that's what James is all about. He's trying to put a little wisdom before us so that we can learn what it looks like to apply my faith to my life so that my faith is adequate as a foundation for me to stand on so that I can weather the storms that life will inevitably bring. And so at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about some people that build their house on the sand. And when life brings storms, the sand beneath their house is washed away and the house collapses. But he says that the people that really get it and are really living in the truth of the gospel are building their house on the rock. And their house is not going anywhere when it rains. Okay, so James is teaching us here what it looks like to build our house on the rock. And the result that we're going to see in each of these discussions that James brings us through is a deeper confidence in God. Okay, a deeper practical confidence in God. It's not just that we understand more things about God, but that our experience of Him is more and more allowing us to really entrust Him with the weight of our lives as we learn to follow the wise counsel that comes to us in the context of our suffering. And so in this sense, the words of James are pretty timeless and super valuable to us because we all suffer. Okay, but for different people, there seems to be different outcomes. And it just seems like some of us fail in our suffering. Some of us are like crushed by our suffering. It's really sad sometimes to see just how differently people can be shaped by their trials. Even the same trials, right? 2 people can come out of the same family, and one of them can come out of the ordeal, like family's an ordeal. One of them can come out of the ordeal pretty well put together, okay? And another one can come out of the same family deeply wounded, even though they experienced very similar things in their lives. So some people are strengthened by their ordeals, and some people are destroyed by their ordeals. Some people go off to war and they come back emotionally and psychologically shattered. And other people experience the very same things, and they come back with a perspective that enables them to digest what they've experienced and to actually be strengthened by those experiences. All right, and this morning what we're trying to do is follow this discussion that James is having into like what it is that makes people emerge out of great suffering stronger as people, and what makes some people with the same kinds of experiences just collapse spiritually and emotionally and relationally. So there's a lot at stake, and that's why we're going to try and explore that here, and we're going to do it the same way that James does it, by way of contrast. So we have the path to victory in trials, and we have the path to defeat in trials, which James identifies in two different senses. Okay, and the first is the heart attitude that is always there when trials and suffering actually have a redemptive and positive effect in your life, and the heart attitude that is always present when suffering undoes us and when we're destroyed by it. All right, so there are two things that James gets at here, and the first is consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials. So the first attitude is this attitude of joy. All right, we need to be able to see that James is not advocating some kind of masochism here, where we're supposed to be excited at the prospect of some suffering coming our way. All right, he says to consider it joy when you suffer, not consider it joy that you suffer. Okay, you see the difference? It's a pretty important distinction. Okay, we're not supposed to be seeking suffering. Plenty of suffering is going to find you without you going looking for it. But when suffering does come to us, James says that the attitude that's going to lead to victory in your life is to meet the suffering with a certain sense of joy. All right, and that's really an attitude of faith, okay, or a belief that God is in the mix. There's a confidence that we're expressing when we can say that even though we don't really understand why we're suffering, we don't understand why a disease is taking over our body or why people have failed you relationally. All right, none of those are the issue. The issue is not that you're in whatever situation. The issue is that you are not in that situation alone. Okay, God is in that thing with you. And I can consider it joy, or I can be thankful because I know that a good God is partnered with me in life. And so this is very similar to what Paul says in Romans 8:28, where he says that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Okay, God causes things to work for the good. He doesn't cause the bad things to happen. But as we learn to entrust our lives to him, there aren't any things that we experience that God can't use productively in our lives. He also says that when we encounter various trials, we know that the testing produces endurance. So there's an effect that approaching trials with this heart attitude has. And that effect is a maturity. Okay, endurance is an important concept that's very common in New Testament discussions of faith. And it's sort of embodied in the idea of training. All right, to persevere or to endure is to undergo training. And so some of us may consider ourselves athletes. I'm not one of them. But I have participated in athletic endeavors, and so I understand that in order to perform and compete and to win, you don't just show up to the race with a martini in one hand and a cigar in the other. All right, I kind of did that once at the Gate River Run about a decade ago, and I would not recommend it. All right, it is most assuredly a losing strategy. Okay, don't stop at every beer cart and hot dog stand along the way. All right, so instead, we know that in order to compete and do well requires the endurance that only training can bring. And the life of faith is no different. All right, as we're learning what it means to trust in Christ, it's going to mean that I'm going to have to go through some things that are going to stretch me and challenge me and make me feel uncomfortable. And there will be points where I'm going to ache. But I'll know that I'm aching because I'm building muscle mass. Right? That's kind of what he's talking about. It's building strength for me. and I'm going to be more effective on the other side of this trial. So that's what James is saying here. If we can approach our struggles with this confidence that God is involved, and we're looking for where God is active and how we can thank him, then we're going to be able to experience the benefit of our suffering with this deeper knowledge and this deeper connection with God. He says, and let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. All right, so we don't endure just for endurance's sake, or just so that we can say we made it through this terrible thing. All right, I do that a lot. He says that it is so that it has its perfect result, that you be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. All right, so this is a great verse, and this idea of being perfect and complete is a very old world idea. And this is the word teleos, which basically means that this is God's design for you. And so if you're wanting to become the man or woman of God that God intends for you to be, then suffering is the only path available to you that will shape you and mold you into the person that God wants for you to be. All right? And indeed, that is the best possible you that there is. All right? The one that God intends for you to be. And so there are certain things, certain traits that can only come to us through the growth we experience inside of suffering. Okay, if you never experience any suffering in a world like this one, like maybe you just live in a hermetically sealed bubble, okay, you would be deprived of a certain number of necessary character traits. Okay, relationships require some things that can only be learned through suffering. Okay, like humility and empathy. Okay, to relate to another person deeply requires that you know in a tangible way how they feel. If you're always protected from suffering, how can you possibly know what it is that the rest of us are feeling? Anybody ever tried to make you feel better or give you advice and you can just tell that it's like a total shell of counsel, right? The advice has no depth at all because they've never experienced anything like what you're talking about or what you're going through. All right, so give me someone that's had their butt handed to them by life and they've responded well, and that's someone that I would like to hear from, hear their advice. So some of us are actually here this morning because what we really want is to have our lives count for Christ. And part of that is going to be how it is that we can respond to the real suffering that is going on in our life. So how does suffering complete God's design for me? Right, how about grace? It's pretty hard to exercise forgiveness if you've never sinned or been sinned against. All right, so that's like the whole message of Christianity. He took upon himself the guilt of all of humanity, and he knows how it feels to be betrayed and to be unjustly treated and to be put to death for something that someone else did. And so if we're going to follow him, we're going to follow him down that path. And so all of the things that really matter about connecting with people can only come to us if we're willing to sit in the school of suffering. Okay, God calls us to suffer. And Jesus said that if you want to follow him, that's great, but you're going to need to pick up your cross. Okay, this is what he's talking about. So that's the first point in the pathway to victory in the trials. It's the ability to be thankful and joyous and see that the painful things that we're experiencing are part of his plan for us. So then starting in verse 6, he gives us a contrast. But we must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So he's giving us the opposite of a person that approaches suffering from the standpoint of trust and joy and the ability to be thankful to God. And he calls this person a doubter or a double-minded man. So this is an important distinction, right? By doubt, he's not saying that suffering does not produce certain questions in our minds about who God is and what he's like, okay? It many times does produce those kinds of questions. We wonder what kind of God allows the scale of suffering that, many people are left to endure. Those are valuable and appropriate questions. All right, but they're not the questions that James has. James is talking about something very different, and he's talking about someone who is double-minded, someone who is duplicitous in their heart. Someone who has an attitude in their heart that is a doubting heart. And this is not an intellectual problem. All right, this is a person who has a certain sense of entitlement or a resentment in the face of trials and suffering. All right, the first thing out of their mouth is, why me? Okay, when the phone rings and it's bad news, this double-minded person is wondering what it is that they did to deserve this. And in our hearts, most of us really are like this. All right, there's a voice in our head that is constantly arguing that we are entitled to live in a broken world completely protected, so that the evil that goes on in the world never touches us. And when we do begin to experience suffering of any kind, any, disapprovals or any failures, we're really tempted to be resentful. Why has God allowed this terrible thing to happen to me? Okay. And if this is the attitude of our heart, then this attitude will also have a certain effect. Okay, he says that this person is going to be like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. It's kind of a vivid picture, I think. Is that you? Right? You know those little white bubbles that form on waves and at the shoreline? Right? Gray or brown bubbles if you're at Lake Erie. Right? They're just like shifted around all the time. They're pushed from one place to the other with no will of their own at all. They're constantly in motion from forces outside of themselves, and he calls them unstable. Okay, so there's an instability that he's talking about here. If your heart is a doubting heart, then really what you're doing is impugning the character of God, where you're basically saying that you don't deserve the treatment that you're getting in life. And this will definitely produce for you a sense of instability because you're looking for something to blame for the lack of comfort that you're experiencing. And such a person is always going to be a slave to circumstances. Okay, that's what this whole word picture about the froth on the water is supposed to elicit from us. The idea of instability, the idea of being the passive effect of all of the other causes. And a person that really has in their heart this idea that they shouldn't be made to suffer is a person that is frantic to control circumstances so that they don't feel any suffering. All right, they're always drawing lines in relationships. They're drawing lines in how much they're willing to give because they know that in giving, they might be let down or some other kind of suffering. So they draw the lines and they control circumstances so that it's comfortable for them. All right, but not only is it not really possible, and a failing approach to life, it's also not at all God's way to try and control all these things. You can never control how people respond. You can never control completely your health or the economy. Okay, and trying, frantically to control these things leads to a very despairing attitude where we're sort of resigned, right? And we give up eventually. We lose the sense of vision that our life could really be about something important. When we count the cost of really making a difference in the world, we back way off and try to control our lives in order to minimize suffering. And we're left in a despairing place where we sense that God intends something great for my life, but because of my aversion to suffering, I've drawn these lines that I feel like I shouldn't have to cross. And the two things are like irreconcilable. I'm stuck between these two competing values, and the result is despair. And in the life of a Christian, this pretty much takes you right out of the race. Okay, the fear of suffering neutralizes your effectiveness in anything that God may have for you. Nothing about this kind of life shows the reality of the love of Christ. Okay, you're not choosing to embrace suffering and be shaped and molded by it. Second contrast here, James says, "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trials, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised those who love him. Let no one say when he is being tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then, when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin brings forth death." So this is contrast number 2. Blessed is the person who perseveres under trials. Okay, he's calling us to an attitude where we don't look at trials as some terrible evil to just get past. Okay, we need to see it as part of God's blessing on our life. Right? I said what I said. Part of God's blessing. So no matter what we're going through, we can see that God is involved and he's gracious in an unfair world. And that doesn't mean that he will protect us from suffering. But because he's merciful, he has called us into suffering. Seems a little weird, right? Doesn't it? But that's exactly what James is saying. Blessed is a person who endures in their suffering. Okay, we do live in an unfair world. And the world sort of thinks in terms of cause and effect, where like nice things happen to nice people and bad things happen to bad people. And that sort of matrix does reside in our minds. And when things go south for the people around you, what is the first thing that comes to your mind, O comforter of Job? Right? What'd you do to deserve that? Right? Must have done something wrong. We always think this. And as a result, since we're living in relatively good circumstances, in the back of our minds, we believe that we must have done something right, or we must be pretty good people. But the blessing that James is talking about here is that God never treats us the way we deserve. All right, that's the essence of the Christian message. God does not do nice things for nice people and then judge the bad people. And the reason for that is that we're all bad. Okay, James is saying that when we encounter trials, we need to count it as a blessing that God has not abandoned us. He's there with you, working these things for good. Okay, in Acts 5, Peter and John have this very public thing going on in Jerusalem, and they've been arrested for for the second time, and the authorities have pretty much had enough. So they're beaten pretty badly. All right. And they're told that there's going to be no more of this, like Jesus is the Messiah stuff. Okay. Peter and John pretty much respond with, like, whatever. Okay. Do what you got to do, and we're going to do what we have to do. And then in Acts 5:41, we're given the editorial comment that they counted it as a blessing from God to be beaten for the name of Christ. Right? Wow. Like, how's that? Like, God is going to use the toughness of a person that's willing to stand in there against scorn and beatings to spread the message. Okay, God used this event and these men's response to this event to spread the gospel, right? Like, clearly. And this sort of captures the idea that trials are not just something to endure. They're opportunities to experience the power and the grace of God. So then James itemizes this a little bit for us. It says that he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised. So there's an assurance that comes with this idea of the crown of life. Okay, we can stand in there with the Lord because we know what the end of the story is. We know who wins in the end. You can endure quite a bit if you know you're going to win. All right? And you are going to win. So you can endure it all if you know that it's not just senseless, pointless suffering. There's a real end to it all. And so we're continuing the passage here. This is verse 16, and he says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow." And here James is just saying that we need to go back to who God is. And we're not operating from some abstract, vaguely theological sense of what we know about God, but in an extremely personal way. We do not just believe that God is sovereign. We have experienced the sovereignty of God in our lives. Okay, that's a whole different thing. And this is not just that I read a book and I believe that this is true. This is about the way that I know that God has treated me. God has shown himself to be trustworthy in my life. Okay, there is no variation, no shifting shadow. That's what James is saying here. Okay, we are sure that there is a consistency about God because we've tasted it as God has been with us in our suffering. And so finally, he says, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. All right, that's some pretty Jewish talk. First fruits is a festival, the beginning of the harvest. And so if you attend this church fairly regularly, then you know exactly what we're talking about. He says that we are the first fruits. So this is a description that's used throughout the New Testament. And the idea is that we have experienced the kindness of God as he has been with us in difficult moments. And that gives us a deep and personal confidence that this is just the beginning. Okay, this is the promise of the same thing in the future. God is going to continue to perfect the work that he began. I can trust him. He's for real. And this moment of experiencing God in deep suffering gives me the confidence to take a look at what life has for me and just be like, bring it. Okay, I know in whom I have trusted, and he's got this. So back in the previous set of verses, he had said that on the other hand, let no one say when he is being tempted, I am being tempted by God. So that's the contrasting point of view. Instead of seeing our trials as an opportunity for blessing, we're all about the blame game. Okay, we start to wonder if God is good. And in our deep resentment, we start to think that maybe he's not. Okay, we're absolutely convinced that we do not deserve this kind of suffering. Okay, never tell God what you think you deserve. Okay, you couldn't be any more confused about how all this works if that's how you approach God. And yet, so many of us, when we have a little suffering or when we're talking to a friend who's suffering, our very first thought is that, this is someone's fault. And someone needs to pay for this. It isn't me, but somebody needs to pay for this. Somebody needs to be held accountable. And James is a little bit stern in his warning against this. Okay, he says that the result is that each one is tempted when we're carried away by our own lust. So you don't need anyone else to blame. Okay, stick with the stuff that you're responsible for. When lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin brings forth death. Okay, you really don't need to extrapolate past your own nose in order to understand why you're suffering. All right, it's a really good place to start. And for most of us, the vast majority of our suffering has only to do with ourselves. Okay, and that's what he's talking about here. Of course, there are exceptions to this. Okay, but that's not really the point. The point is to capture the reason that most of us suffer most of the time. It's because of our heart that blames our circumstances and is ultimately blaming God that shows that we are deceived and we're becoming increasingly deceived. Okay, we are chronically unable to face our own responsibility. Why are our marriages staggering against the ropes? You don't need to look any further than this right here. It is the fundamental inability to face the responsibility that I have made mistakes. Okay, Jesus gave the instruction that we take the log out of our own eyes so that we can take the speck out of our brother's. Okay, we're struggling because we're self-justifying. We're unwilling and maybe unable because we've repeated this narrative over and over in our minds and in our hearts that it is someone else's fault and there's another person to blame. And the result is that we become very bitter people. Okay, that's a real danger. Suffering can produce bitterness. Suffering self-righteously and saying that you don't deserve it means that we have to blame someone outside of ourselves, and therefore even the God of the universe has let us down. Okay, the way that this shapes the heart of man is to make us bitter and lonely and disengaged and disappointed. It's a pretty horrible place to be. And I think that we need to think about this some this morning. So there are two possible paths for you to go. One of them really is a path of blessing. And if we're prepared to entrust ourselves to God in the context of our suffering. And the other is the path where we're blaming others and we're ultimately blaming God. And the result of this is a deep self-deception and an instability. And it's possible, as we sit here this morning, to determine your heart attitude towards suffering by reasoning backwards from how we feel right now. Okay, how are you doing with the suffering in your life? Have you become angry, bitter, unstable? Or in His mercy has the Lord shaped you and molded you and matured you and completed you through the suffering that in His mercy He's allowed us to enter into? All right, so that's the principle that James is laying out here. That's the framework that we have for the ways that we engage with difficult situations in life. And so we're going to try and wrap this up. He says that if any of you lacks wisdom, I think that might include a few of us. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So the way of wisdom is actually pretty simple, which does not correlate at all to it being easy. But the first thing is, we all suffer in this world. If you're not suffering deeply right now, you will be in the future. And you need to know that. So in our culture, we can control some things, and we're able to keep suffering at arm's length a lot of times in nursing homes and other kinds of places. So we don't see it a lot, and we're not a part of it. And we like to think that we're not going to suffer. But you are going to suffer. And you're all going to be confused when we suffer. Okay, why me is a natural question. But we can't stay there. Okay? But it's true that we're all going to be initially confused by the things that we experience in life. And so therefore, as this passage has pointed out, we're all going to face a decision. And this decision is, will you seek a generous and gracious God? Or are you going to live on in stiff-lipped despair? And that's the question that James is laying on the table this morning in this opening to his letter. Okay, he says that God is generous. He gives wisdom generously to all who are prepared to draw near to him, without blame, without bitterness, but with a willingness to say that God has spoken, and God is a God of mercy and grace, and God has brought all the resources of heaven to my aid. Okay, just ask God in his mercy to help you take the next step, and then the step after that, and then the one after that. And so eventually you can look back and see clearly the goodness of God and the provision of God and the redemptive hand of God in our suffering. And so maybe you do not have a personal confidence that there's more and that life is not just a series of tragic events followed by extinction. Okay, you might be one who's never really met the personal God who is your creator. And I would just encourage you that the first step toward wisdom and putting your life together in a meaningful way is to respond to the good news of Jesus Christ. Okay, he's come into the world and taken upon himself the ultimate trial and suffering, which is your sin. And having paid for that debt by his own death, he invites you to receive his forgiveness and become reconciled with God, so that God, who is the judge, stands forever as your heavenly Father, who is deeply committed to your best good in your life. All right, so that's the decision that you need to make to receive that gift. And then you'll be well on your way to being able to understand what we just went through in the first chapter of James. All right, so we'll be back in the first chapter next week. But that's all for this morning.